Denver was cold, the kind of bone-chilling cold that leaves downtown glass windows coated in a thin layer of mist. It was nearly 11 at night. Slushy, melting snow trickled across the dark grey sidewalks, reflecting the long yellow lights stretching down from the towering financial buildings onto the wet, freezing streets. A black cab pulled up in front of the Kingsley Meridian Medical Center, a place locals called by a much more prestigious name, the Hospital for Millionaires. Grace Whitmore sat frozen for a few seconds inside the cab before finally opening the door to step out. A sharp contraction tightened across her belly, forcing her to grip the edge of the seat. It was stronger than the last one, deeper. Like someone was slowly pulling every nerve in her body in opposite directions. The driver glanced at her through the rear-view mirror. "You okay, miss?" Grace nodded quickly, more out of sheer embarrassment than actually being okay. She dug through her worn, peeling brown wallet, counted her remaining cash one last time, and handed him a crumpled $20 bill. "Keep the change." The driver looked down at her pregnant belly, then glanced at the towering building ahead, his eyes filled with hesitation. "Do you have someone waiting for you inside?" Grace paused for a split second. Yes, but they both knew it was a lie. She stepped out into the cold, pulling her threadbare grey wool coat tighter around her body. The biting November wind cut right through the thin fabric, sending a shiver through her shoulders. A drop of water fell from her hair onto her collar. Then, another rolled down her cheek. Ahead of her, the Kingsley Meridian Medical Center glowed like a 5-star hotel in the freezing Denver night. The marble steps were kept dry by an underfloor heating system. 2 supercars parked at the main entrance reflected the soft, warm light shining from the glass canopy. A valet in a sharp black suit bowed as he opened the door for a wealthy couple stepping out of a silver Rolls-Royce. The woman, wrapped in a white cashmere coat, rested her hand on her beautifully cared-for baby bump. The man beside her guided her gently, supporting her every step as if afraid the world might break her. Grace stood in the rain, watching them for a few seconds longer than she should have. Then, she lowered her head and kept walking. The scent of expensive sandalwood and fresh white lilies drifted out the moment the automatic glass doors slid open. It was so quiet inside that Grace could clearly hear the faint piano notes drifting from the lounge across the lobby. A pianist was playing Claire de Lune under the soft yellow lights that stretched across the cream-colored marble floor. This place didn't feel like a hospital. It felt like a place reserved for people who had never had to worry about money in their entire lives. Grace paused at the entrance as another contraction hit. She bent over slightly, her knuckles white, as she gripped the strap of her faded duffel bag. Inside, there were only a few neatly folded baby clothes, a bottle of water, her insurance paperwork, and her late mother's old hospital wristband. She always carried it with her. The day her mother passed away from pancreatic cancer, Grace was only 17. That thin white plastic band was the very last thing left with her mother's name on it. The receptionist behind the front desk sized her up from head to toe before offering a rehearsed professional smile. "Welcome. How can I assist you tonight?" Grace tried to stand a little taller, even though the pain in her back was taking her breath away. I think I'm in labor." The receptionist's smile stiffened slightly as her eyes swept over Grace's threadbare coat and worn-down shoes. "Of course. May I see your insurance card and ID, please?" Grace pulled out her wallet with trembling fingers. A raindrop fell from her wet hair, landing right on the polished marble counter. She hated this feeling, the humiliating feeling of having to prove your worth to someone else. Another sharp contraction gripped her belly, making her gasp for air. She clung to the edge of the counter, while the receptionist slowly typed her information into the system. Two women dressed in designer labels walked past. One of them lowered her voice, but not enough to stop Grace from hearing. "My goodness, is she here all by herself?" The other woman glanced at the faded duffel bag in Grace's hand, raising a subtle eyebrow. Must have walked into the wrong hospital. Grace kept her eyes glued to the floor. She had grown used to those kinds of looks over the past few months. The judgment reserved for a pregnant woman without a wedding ring. The cold stares meant for people who simply don't belong in such sparkling places. The sharp click of high heels echoed from the far end of the lobby. It wasn't rushed. It was completely deliberate, cold, clinical, and precise. Vanessa Crowe appeared in a perfectly tailored black suit, her blonde hair swept back into a neat bun. Her operations manager badge caught the warm glow of the yellow lights as she approached the reception desk. Every staff member nearby instantly stood a little straighter. Vanessa looked at Grace first, not as if she were looking at a patient, but as if she were looking at a problem. "What's going on here?" The receptionist lowered her voice. "A new labor patient just came in, but it looks like she doesn't have the maternity premium package." Vanessa reached out and took the tablet. Grace felt a chill run down her spine, even though the lobby was warm. Vanessa scanned the file for a few seconds, then her expression shifted. Ever so slightly, but it was enough for Grace to notice. Vanessa Crowe didn't say a word at first. She just stood there under the warm lights of the lobby, clutching the silver tablet, her eyes slowly scanning every line of Grace Whitmore's insurance file, as if inspecting a package delivered to the wrong address. Then she looked up. The smile on her lips was still picture perfect, but her eyes had gone cold. "Is this your first baby?" Grace nodded, clutching her stomach as a sharper, stronger contraction ripped through her. Vanessa glanced down at the Cartier watch on her wrist. "Do you have a private doctor on call?" "No. Is your family on their way?" Grace felt her throat go dry. "There's no one." A brief silence filled the air, short enough that no one could call it rude, but long enough for Grace to realize she had just been judged. Vanessa handed the tablet back to the receptionist. "Take Ms. Whitmore down to the maternity overflow wing." The receptionist hesitated. "But that wing is undergoing partial maintenance." Vanessa kept her eyes locked on Grace, then used the room at the end of the west hallway. That room was typically reserved for emergency transfers. It was much smaller than the luxury suites upstairs, but Vanessa didn't care. What she cared about was that tonight 3 extremely wealthy families were staying in the VIP maternity wing, including the wife of a major Aspen hotel chain owner and the daughter of a Colorado state senator. Kingsley Meridian didn't just sell hospital beds. It sold the feeling of absolute privilege. And Grace Whitmore ruined that perfect picture the moment she walked in with her rain-soaked shoes and faded bag. A young nurse led Grace through the lobby. She was about 23 years old, her brown hair pulled back in a high ponytail, with a name tag that read Allison Reed. At first, Allison tried to keep her voice gentle, but after Vanessa walked past and lingered behind her for a few seconds, Allison's attitude shifted almost instantly. The nurse wouldn't even look Grace in the eye anymore. She didn't even bother to ask if she was in pain. They stepped into the private elevator for the maternity ward. The brass walls reflected Grace's pale face under the soft lights. Her hair was damp from the rain, a few strands clinging to her cheeks. Her worn grey sweater made her look like someone who had accidentally stumbled into a private gala for the ultra-wealthy. The elevator stopped on the 6th floor. The doors slid open. Grace looked out into a completely different world. The hallway is lined with a plush, cream-colored carpet. Small crystal chandeliers hang from the ceiling, casting a soft glow. The gentle notes of a piano melody drift from hidden speakers in the walls. Each polished wooden door is marked with a gold-plated nameplate. A man in a sharp suit stood outside a VIP room, clutching a bouquet of white roses. From inside, soft laughter drifted out, along with the sound of someone chatting about non-alcoholic champagne for the new mother. Grace instinctively looked down at the worn-out bag in her hands. Then Allison turned down a side hallway, slipping behind a door marked for staff only. Instantly, everything changed. The lights grew stark and white. The ceilings felt lower. The hum of the air conditioner grew louder. There was no trace of sandalwood or lilies anymore, only the cold, sterile smell of antiseptic. Grace was led to the very last room at the end of the hall. The off-white paint on the door was peeling at the bottom. As Allison opened it, Grace saw a tiny room with nothing but a single hospital bed and a narrow window overlooking the back parking lot. A delivery truck sat parked under the cold, pale blue light. Grace stood frozen for a few seconds. "Is this my room?" Allison avoided her gaze. "It's only temporary." Grace was smart enough to know it was just a polite lie. Another wave of pain hit, forcing her to grip the edge of the table. Without another word, Allison began hooking up the fetal heart monitor. Her movements were quick and precise, but completely stripped of the warmth and gentleness Grace had seen her show the VIP patients upstairs. Grace slowly lay back. The ceiling above was a cold, empty white. The steady, robotic beep of the monitor echoed in her ears. She turned her face toward the small window at the end of the room, and suddenly, she remembered Evan. Every memory of him always started with summer. The scent of roasted coffee in that little shop in Boulder. The navy blue shirt he always wore. The way he smiled when talking about the trips they would take together someday. Evan used to say he wanted to buy a small house near Lake Tahoe, with a wooden porch, a cozy fireplace, and the sound of children running around the yard. Grace had believed every single word. She remembered the night she told him she was pregnant. He was quiet for a very long time, not happy, not angry. Just like someone who had just heard something far too big for them to handle. Then I asked, "Are you sure?" Grace had smiled through her tears as she handed him the ultrasound photo. But Evan didn't look at it for long. 2 days later, he said he needed time to think. A week later, his phone was completely disconnected. A month later, Grace realized she had been completely abandoned. She worked extra shifts all on her own. She went to her prenatal checkups by herself. Woke up at 3 a.m. from painful cramps, all alone. Learned how to pretend she was fine whenever people asked where the baby's father was. The sound of the door swinging open snapped Grace back to reality. 2 other nurses walked in carrying medical equipment. They talked to each other right in front of her, as if she didn't even exist. Did VIP Suite 3 ask to switch their mineral water? Yeah, some brand from Norway, I think. Good Lord, they both shared a quiet chuckle. Then one of them looked at Grace. It was just a quick glance, but it was enough for her to see the pity mixed with annoyance. Grace looked away. She hated that look even more than outright contempt. At least, contempt was honest. 10 minutes later, the contraction was so intense she had to double over on the bed. She pressed the nurse call button. Nobody came right away. Grace looked at the clock. 4 minutes, then 6 minutes. Finally, Allison walked in, looking slightly annoyed. "What do you need?" Grace panted heavily. "I think the contractions are getting closer." Allison gave the monitor a quick glance. "I'll let the doctor know." She turned and walked out almost instantly. Before the door could fully close, Grace heard Vanessa's voice echoing from the hallway. "Just keep her in there, but there are empty rooms upstairs." A brief silence. Then Vanessa's voice dropped, cold as ice. "We can't have patients like her anywhere near the VIP section." Vanessa Crowe didn't need to yell to terrify people. She possessed a much colder kind of power, a lingering look, a well-placed silence, a quiet remark that was enough for the staff to know that if they didn't comply, their names would end up on Monday morning's performance review. Leaving the side hallway, Vanessa walked into the maternity coordination room like someone smoothing a crease on an expensive dress. On the large screen, the delivery rooms at Kingsley Meridian were displayed in light blue boxes. The maternity luxury suite's floor was nearly full. Suite 1 was reserved for the wife of a Vail real estate investor. Suite 2 was for the daughter of a state senator. Suite 3 was waiting for a family that owned 3 ski resorts in Aspen. At the very bottom of the list, Grace Whitmore's name sat in a small grey box. Vanessa looked at it with absolute irritation. She pulled up her chair, opened the patient file, and began making edits. Nothing drastic, just tiny tweaks, so subtle that unless someone was looking closely, they'd pass for a system glitch. Grace's status code was changed from active labor to routine observation. Her request for an anesthesiologist was bumped to the bottom of the queue. The note about her intensifying contractions was wiped from the live feed. Her assigned nurse was swapped to someone currently tied up with a VIP case upstairs. The whole thing took less than 3 minutes. Vanessa leaned back in her chair. To her, this wasn't cruelty. It was risk management. A hospital like Kingsley Meridian lived and breathed on its image. The corridors smelling of sandalwood, the birthing suites with private living rooms, the postpartum meals served on white porcelain, and husbands in tailored suits leaning down to kiss their wives' foreheads under soft, warm lighting. Nobody paid top dollar to see a lonely woman in a worn-out coat, clutching her aching belly right in front of the VIP wing. Vanessa truly believed she was protecting their standards, and people who believe they are in the right are always far more dangerous than those who know they are evil. In the room at the end of the west hallway, Grace Whitmore was starting to lose track of time. The pain was coming faster now. Every time it receded, she had just a few minutes to breathe, to listen to the rain drumming against the narrow window pane, and to watch the back parking lot lights blur into hazy yellow streaks on the wet asphalt. And then it would return, even stronger. She pressed the nurse call button for the second time. Nobody came. The monitor beside her beeped steadily, faint and cold. Grace watched the paper strip tracking her baby's heartbeat slowly roll out of the machine. Those jagged lines were the only thing in the room proving she wasn't entirely alone. "You're still there. You're still fighting with me." Grace placed her hand over her belly. "Mommy's here," she whispered so softly it was barely audible even to her. "Mommy won't leave you." Out in the hallway, Allison Reed walked past Grace's room twice but didn't go in. She looked at her tablet, where Grace's file was flagged as routine observation. No priority for anesthesia, no official labor room assigned. But on the secondary monitor at the nurse's station, the frequency of the contractions was visibly spiking. Allison hesitated. Then her internal phone buzzed. Vanessa's voice came through, low and curt. "The 6th floor needs you to assist in Suite 3. Right now." Allison looked back toward Grace's room, but she walked away anyway. Because at Kingsley Meridian, young staff learned very quickly that compassion didn't pay the bills, but defying a single order from Vanessa Crowe could cost them their entire career. At the far end of the opposite hallway, Nurse Helen Brooks was about to wrap up her shift when she heard a stifled groan from behind the ivory door. She stopped in her tracks. Helen had been a labor and delivery nurse for 31 years. She had heard the cries of thousands of women in labor, and she knew some sounds didn't need a doctor's confirmation. Just hearing the way a woman tried to hold back her cries, the way her breath broke in the middle, and the way her hand tapped against the bed rail to keep herself conscious. Helen knew this labor was progressing much faster than the chart showed. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. Grace was lying on her side, hair matted to her temples, one hand clutching the white sheets while the other held her stomach tight. Her lips were pale, a thin sheen of sweat covered her forehead. Helen rushed to her side immediately. "Ms. Whitmore, I'm Helen. Let me check on you." Grace opened her eyes. In her gaze was that familiar shame of someone who had been ignored for so long. They had begun to believe they shouldn't be a burden to anyone. "I'm so sorry. I pressed the call button. I didn't want to cause any trouble." Helen froze just for a split second. No woman in labor is ever a hassle. She snapped her gloves on, did a quick examination, and her expression instantly shifted. Grace was way past the early stages of labor. She was already in active labor, and the baby was coming fast. Helen glanced at the digital monitor hanging by the bed. The readings did not match Grace's actual condition. She opened her backup tablet, logged into the patient chart, and immediately spotted the red flags. The request for an epidural had been pushed to the back of the line, contraction updates were missing crucial data, and her priority status had been downgraded to low. Helen stared at the screen. She had been a nurse long enough to know what a system glitch looked like, and this was no glitch. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Helen reached for it out of habit. A notification from the cardiology clinic popped up on the screen. The next medical bill for her husband, Martin Brooks, was due. The outstanding balance, $18,746.29. She stared at that number a moment too long. Martin had been bedridden for 4 months, his heart so weak that every single cough made Helen hold her breath. Insurance only covered a fraction of the cost. Their savings had slipped through their fingers like water. This job at Kingsley Meridian was the only thing keeping the bank from taking their small home in Aurora. If she crossed Vanessa, she could lose her job, and if she lost her job, Martin would lose his chance at surgery. Another wave of intense pain ripped through Grace. She curled inward, her hands gripping the edge of the mattress so tightly that her knuckles turned stark white. Helen looked down at her. Then she looked back at the unpaid bill on her screen. For a few agonizing seconds, the small room was so quiet she could hear the rain tapping against the window pane, and the steady, fragile beep of the monitor tracking the heartbeat of a child who had yet to see the world. Some choices are made in complete silence, but they tear a person right down the middle. Helen turned off the screen and slipped the phone back into her pocket. She leaned in closer to Grace, her voice quiet but steady. "Listen to me, Grace. You do not need to prove you are worthy of care. You are bringing a child into this world. That is more than enough." Grace looked up at her, her eyes bloodshot with pain, and with something else that hurt far worse than physical labor. For the first time that night, someone was speaking to her, like she was an actual human being. Helen stood up and stepped quickly out into the hallway. She paged the anesthesiologist. No one answered. She called the main delivery ward. A receptionist told her that Grace's file had not been cleared for priority status yet. Helen looked over at the nurse's station, where Vanessa stood behind the frosted glass, talking with a young doctor about the VIP patient upstairs. She understood instantly. She had to get Grace out of this room before things took a turn for the worse. Helen hurried back into the room, disconnected the temporary monitor leads, and prepared the gurney. Grace looked at her, panicked. What's happening? Helen pulled the blanket over her, her voice calm, almost gentle. We are moving you to a different room. But they told me I had to stay here. Helen locked the wheels of the bed, leaning in to look Grace dead in the eye. They say a lot of things. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Allison was heading back, followed by an administrator holding a clipboard. Helen was running out of time. She opened a side door leading into the service corridor used for transporting medical equipment, a route with fewer security cameras that bypassed the main VIP lobby. The back hallway was darker, illuminated only by long, cold streaks of white light casting down onto the tiled floor. Grace bit her lip as Helen wheeled her bed out. The pain made her shiver, but she didn't cry out. Helen scanned the hallways as she pushed the bed, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it ringing in her ears. At the end of the corridor, a small sign flickered under the dim lights. Delivery room 4. It wasn't the most luxurious, but it was clean, fully equipped, safe enough, and most importantly, far enough from Vanessa's reach for the next few crucial minutes. Helen wheeled Grace inside, shut the door, and quickly drew the white curtains around the bed. She knew that after tonight, Vanessa Crowe would show her no mercy. She also knew her husband still needed money she had no idea how to find. But when Grace grabbed her wrist through a wave of pain and whispered a quiet thank you, Helen didn't feel like someone who had just made a terrible mistake. She just felt like a nurse again. Delivery room 4 was much smaller than the luxury maternity suites on the other side of the 6th floor. There were no cream-colored leather sofas, no espresso machines imported from Italy, no massive glass windows overlooking the Denver skyline. Just soft white light, the steady rhythmic beep of the monitor, and the cold, sterile smell of antiseptic hanging in the air. But to Grace Whitmore, it felt more like heaven than that room at the end of the West Wing. At least here someone looked at her like a human being. Helen drew the privacy curtain and quickly checked the baby's heart rate. The green waves on the screen were still rising and falling steadily. The baby was doing fine. Grace closed her eyes as another contraction hit. It didn't even feel like pain anymore. It felt as if invisible hands were gripping her spine from the inside, slowly breaking it bone by bone. She bit down hard on her lower lip to keep from screaming. Helen gently placed a cool cloth on her forehead. "Don't try so hard to be strong. Just breathe." Grace nodded weakly, but she still tried to stay quiet. She had spent almost the entire past year trying to take up as little space as possible in other people's lives, trying not to bother anyone, trying not to be a burden. That habit was harder to break than the physical pain. The clock on the wall read 4:42 in the morning. The real labor had only just begun. Outside, the sound of a medical cart rolled quickly down the hall before fading away. Further off, there was faint laughter from the VIP wing, the clinking of glassware, and a man's voice asking if his wife needed another pillow for her back. Two completely different worlds coexisting on the very same floor. On one side were people who paid tens of thousands of dollars to give birth in absolute luxury. On the other was Grace Whitmore, a girl who had spent months budgeting every single pack of instant ramen at the grocery store just to afford diapers. The next wave of pain hit so fast, she didn't even have time to brace herself. Grace curled inward, her fingernails digging deep into the white bedsheets. Helen looked at the monitor and lowered her voice. "This one's stronger." Grace tried to force a smile. "I guess so." Sweat began to bead on her neck and temples. A stray lock of hair stuck to her cheek. Helen gently brushed it aside. In that moment, Grace was suddenly reminded of her mother. Her mother had done the exact same thing when Grace was 10 years old, burning with a high fever. A simple memory. But in the most painful hours of life, sometimes it is those tiny memories that make you burst into tears. Grace quickly turned her face away. She did not want to cry in front of anyone anymore. 7 in the morning. The snow began to melt outside the narrow window. Denver slowly brightened under a cold, grey sky. In the distance, the faint sound of a medical helicopter echoed through the air, then faded away. Grace had been in labor for nearly 8 hours. She began to shiver from sheer exhaustion. Helen helped her take tiny sips of water. Every now and then, she had to remind her to breathe, as Grace kept forgetting how her own body worked amidst the relentless back-to-back contractions. At times, Grace would drift off for a few minutes, only to startle awake as another sharp contraction squeezed her abdomen. In the brief moments between the pain, memories began to play back like old film strips. She saw herself standing behind the bar at the Fairmont Crest Hotel near midnight, heavily pregnant, but still trying to smile at the wealthy guests. The scent of red wine, the clack of high heels on the marble floor, men wearing expensive watches handing her black cards, never looking her in the eye for more than 2 seconds. Grace remembered the nights her feet were so swollen she had to sit in the locker room, crying quietly for 5 minutes before forcing herself back to her shift. She remembered slipping off her shoes at 2 in the morning, only to find her ankles so swollen they did not even feel like part of her body anymore. She remembered standing for what felt like hours in front of the discount food aisle at Walmart, calculating whether she should buy fresh fruit or save another $12 for baby formula. In the end, she usually chose instant noodles. Cheaper, kept her full longer, and every time she ate that salty broth in her freezing little apartment, she would place her hand on her stomach and whisper an apology to her baby. "Mummy promises. Things will get better." 11 in the morning. The labor was turning out to be more difficult than expected. A resident doctor walked in to check on her, then quickly left to attend to another VIP patient upstairs. The click of his leather shoes echoed sharply against the polished floor before fading down the hallway. The monitor kept emitting steady beeps like an unfeeling clock, counting down every minute of Grace's exhaustion. But Helen was still there. For hours, she barely left the room for more than a few minutes. She changed the cold washcloth, adjusted the pillows, helped Grace sit up when she threw up, squeezed her hand when the pain became too intense, not because the hospital rules required it, but because sometimes true kindness is simply choosing not to leave. Near 1 in the afternoon, Grace began to lose control of her breathing. "I can't do this anymore," she said through choked sobs. I can't." Helen leaned in closer to her. "You are doing it." "No." Grace shook her head frantically, her hair drenched in sweat. I'm so tired I have no strength left." Helen gently squeezed her hand. "Grace, look at me." Grace struggled to open her eyes. No one gets through this moment because they still have strength. They get through it because they love someone more than their own pain. A brief silence filled the room. Then, for the first time since entering the hospital, Grace broke down and really cried. No more trying to hold it together. No more trying to pretend she was okay. She was just a woman who had been far too lonely for far too long. An hour later, the monitor's rhythm changed. The resident doctor returned with 2 other nurses. The tension in the room began to mount. Helen stood right beside the head of the bed. "Grace, listen to me, it's time." The final contraction hit her like a massive wave. Grace screamed for the first time in 12 hours of labor. There was no more shame, no more trying to hold back. There was only the raw, primal instinct of a mother pulling a new life out of her own body. The monitor beeped rapidly. The doctor barked out quick, sharp instructions, the metallic clatter of wheels hitting the instrument tray. Then suddenly everything stopped for one split second. A terrifyingly fragile silence fell over the room. Grace's eyes went wide. "Is he okay?" No one answered right away. Then the first cry rang out, faint, weak, but alive. It was as if the entire room finally let out its breath. Grace sobbed through her shallow, ragged breaths. Her son was crying. Her son was alive. A nurse quickly wrapped the baby in a white blanket and carried him over to the newborn examination table, bathed in the soft yellow light at the corner of the room. Grace struggled to lift her head to see. "I want to see my baby. Just a few more seconds." Helen smiled for the first time during that long night. "He is a beautiful baby boy." Just then, the delivery room door opened. The slow click of leather shoes echoed across the polished floor. Almost instantly, everyone in the room fell silent. Dr. Malcolm Kingsley stepped inside. Dr. Malcolm Kingsley stepped into delivery room number 4 with the calm of a man who had spent more than 30 years watching life begin under harsh white lights. 7. He was tall and lean, his silver hair neatly combed back, and his white lab coat hung over a wrinkle-free light blue shirt. On his chest sat a small metal name tag engraved with Chief of Maternal Surgery. They said he had delivered babies for the governor's wife, a tech billionaire's daughter, flew private jets all the way from California to Denver just to have his signature on their birth records. But as he stepped into that room, Malcolm brought no pride with him. He only brought the old habit of a doctor who always did one last check before leaving the hospital. The baby's cry was still thin in the air, not loud, not fierce, just a tiny sound, but enough to make everyone in the room breathe a sigh of relief after 12 tense hours. Grace lay in bed, drenched in sweat, her face pale from exhaustion. She tried to lift her head, even though her body had almost nothing left. Her eyes never wavered from the infant warmer in the corner of the room, where her baby boy was being wiped clean and wrapped in a white blanket by a nurse. Helen stood beside her, one hand still resting gently on Grace's shoulder, as if afraid she would disappear if no one held on to her. Malcolm took the clipboard from the resident. "How's the mother?" "Stable, doctor. She's exhausted, but no major complications. And the baby? Good heart rate, good crying reflex. Weight is 6 pounds, 11 ounces. Malcolm nodded, his eyes scanning the chart out of habit. Mother's name, age, history of allergies, time of birth 3:17 p.m. Then he walked over to the warming table. A young nurse was just about to lift the baby to bring him to Grace when Malcolm leaned in slightly to look down. Just one look, and his world stood still. At first, no one noticed. Helen only saw Malcolm's hand freeze on the edge of the clipboard. The resident thought he was checking for something unusual on the baby's skin. The young nurse kept her tired smile after the long delivery, waiting for him to signal that she could hand the baby to his mother. But Malcolm didn't say a word. He stared at that tiny face as if he had just seen a door, locked for many years, suddenly swing open right before his eyes. The baby had a small nose with a slight curve at the bridge, identical to a woman who had once stood beside Malcolm in a church on a June morning 37 years ago, holding a bouquet of white peonies and laughing so hard her eyes crinkled in the sunlight. Margaret. The name wasn't spoken aloud, but it sliced through him like a very old knife. Malcolm looked closer. Right behind the baby's left ear, near the soft, damp hairline, was a small, light brown birthmark shaped like a misshapen leaf. It wouldn't be clear to anyone else. It wouldn't be noticed by a busy nurse. But to Malcolm, it was like a signature left by fate, Evan had that exact same mark. Margaret used to call it his autumn leaf. The clipboard slipped slightly in Malcolm's hand. The metal hit the edge of the warming table, making a sound so faint that almost no one heard it, but in a room that had just gone through a birth, the sound was still strange enough to make everyone turn their heads. Helen looked at him. "Dr. Kingsley?" Malcolm didn't answer. The colour slowly drained from his face. His grey eyes, famous for their composure, began to redden, not from exhaustion, nor from the glare of the delivery room lights. Grace was the first to notice the change. With a mother's instinct, she struggled to push herself up on her elbows. Is there something wrong with my baby?" No one answered right away. The young nurse looked at the baby, then at Malcolm, completely confused. "Doctor?" Malcolm blinked once, then a second time, as if forcing himself back to the reality of the room. Back to the beeping monitor, the smell of antiseptic, the harsh white lights, and the people waiting for him to say something normal, so everything could keep moving. But no ordinary words could fit a moment like this. He raised his hand very slowly, not touching the baby, but stopping just a few inches from that tiny face. The hand that had stitched thousands of incisions, that had stayed steady through the worst medical emergencies, was now trembling ever so slightly. Grace watched that hand. Fear flared up in her chest. "Doctor, is something wrong with my baby?" Malcolm finally turned to look at her. His gaze wasn't that of a doctor preparing to deliver bad news. It was far more painful than that. It was much more personal. "Who is the father of this baby?" The room fell dead silent. Grace thought she had misheard him. That question struck her right where she was most vulnerable, a place she had tried to shield for the past 9 months, with endless work, with silence, and with the polite, practiced lies she told whenever someone asked if the father was coming to her checkups. She swallowed hard. "Why? Why are you asking me that?" Malcolm kept his eyes on her, not demanding, not cold. But there was a desperate urgency in his eyes that made Grace feel her heart pound. "I need to know." Helen turned to Malcolm, lowering her voice. "Dr. Kingsley, is there a medical issue?" Malcolm shook his head ever so slightly, but his eyes never left Grace. "The baby is healthy." Grace let out a soft breath, but the fear hadn't left her. If her baby was healthy, why was he looking at him like that? Why would a man known for being so unshakably calm, someone the nurses called Kingsley's iron hand, stand completely frozen before an ordinary newborn? Grace looked over at her baby boy. Wrapped in a white blanket, his eyes were closed, his tiny fist curled tight against his cheek. He had no idea that this room had just been pulled into a secret far larger than his own birth. She turned back to look at Malcolm, his father. "Isn't here? What is his name?" Grace remained silent. That name had always hurt her. Not because it belonged to a man who had walked away, but because it had once sounded like a future she believed in with all the innocence she had left. Evan once spoke his name in a small coffee shop in Boulder, with that crooked smile and a warm voice. Evan had placed his hand on her stomach when the baby was still too small to move, whispering that he would learn how to be a father. And then Evan had vanished, with no explanation kind enough, with no goodbye brave enough. Grace stared at Malcolm for a long moment. Then she whispered, "Evan." Malcolm closed his eyes. The room seemed to hold its breath. Grace felt a lump in her throat, but she kept going, knowing there was no turning back now. Evan Kingsley. No one in the room moved. The heart monitor kept beeping, but the sound suddenly felt distant, as if echoing from the end of a long hallway. The young nurse froze beside the infant warmer. The resident doctor stared at Malcolm in absolute bewilderment. 7. Helen slowly turned her eyes from Grace to Malcolm and then back to the baby, Malcolm opened his eyes. A single tear escaped the corner of his eye before he could stop it. It rolled down the gently wrinkled cheek of a man who had spent years learning how to hide his grief. Grace watched that tear and felt her heart turn cold. You know Evan? Malcolm tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He set the clipboard down on the table, slowly, carefully, as if holding it for even one more second would be too much for his hands to bear. He looked at the baby once more. Margaret's nose, Evan's birthmark. Months missing. A young woman walking into the hospital all alone. A baby born at 3:17 p.m. in a room he was never supposed to be brought to. All because some manager decided his mother wasn't high-class enough. Malcolm took a very slow, deep breath. Then he whispered so quietly that only those in the room could hear. "He's my son." No one in the delivery room said a word for nearly 10 seconds after Malcolm Kingsley spoke. "He's my son." The words weren't loud. They weren't dramatic, but they cut through the room like a crack appearing in a sheet of thick glass. The kind everyone thought was unbreakable. Grace stared at Malcolm. Her brain practically refused to process what she had just heard. Your son?" Malcolm nodded very slowly, his eyes never leaving the baby. "Evan is my son." The heart monitor kept beeping in the background. The young nurse instinctively cradled the baby a little closer, as if terrified of dropping something far more fragile than life itself. Grace felt the room tilt. For nearly 1 year, Evan had been nothing but a ghost in her memory. A man who once talked about the future, only to vanish as if he had never existed. She never imagined that behind him was a real family, a real last name, a real world. Kingsley, the name etched onto every glass wall of this hospital, on every single pen at the reception desk, on every doctor's white coat, on the medical research donor plaque in the main lobby. She had been carrying the child of the family who owned this entire hospital, and she had absolutely no idea. Grace let out a tiny, soft laugh, not because it was funny, but because some truths are just too massive, leaving you with nothing but a hollow laugh to keep yourself from falling apart in. Helen looked at Malcolm. "Doctor? This?" Malcolm finally snapped back to reality. He quickly wiped the corner of his eye, an embarrassed reflex of a man who had spent too many years having to keep himself in perfect control. He took a slow, deep breath. Then he looked at Grace. "Miss Whitmore, I think. We need to talk." But before anyone could say another word, the delivery room door burst open, slamming hard against the wall. Vanessa Crowe stepped inside. The atmosphere shifted instantly. She scanned the room, her eyes cold like someone who had just found an unacceptable flaw in her perfect system. Then her gaze locked onto Helen. For exactly 1 second, just long enough for everyone to realize her fury was hanging by a thread. "I knew it was you." Vanessa's voice was low, sharp as shattered glass. Helen instinctively stood a little straighter. The patient needed a proper delivery room. Vanessa let out a short, cold laugh. No, this patient was assigned to the overflow wing. You took it upon yourself to transfer her files, in direct violation of our protocol. Grace looked from one woman to the other. She was still too weak to understand everything, but alert enough to realize that Helen was standing in the line of fire because of her. Vanessa took a few steps further into the room. Her tailored black suit was so immaculate it felt almost sterile, standing out in a room still heavy with the scent of blood, sweat, and the sharp cries of a newborn. "Do you have any idea who we are hosting tonight, Helen? If one of our VIP families sees an underinsured patient in the main maternity wing." Malcolm cut her off. "Enough." Vanessa froze. For the first time, she realized Malcolm Kingsley was standing in the room. Her expression shifted in a split second. "Dr. Kingsley, I had no idea you were here." There was a slight misunderstanding with the room assignments, and I was just handling it. No. Malcolm looked straight at her. This is not a misunderstanding. The room fell dead silent. Vanessa tried to maintain her professional tone. Doctor, I am only upholding the standards of our premium maternity wing. We have very clear protocols regarding patient classification. And suddenly, Grace sat up. A sharp wave of postpartum pain shot through her abdomen, forcing her to grip the bed rails tightly, but she refused to lie back down. Helen turned to her immediately. Grace, please, you need to lie down. No, it was the first time that night Grace spoke without an apology in her voice. She looked at Vanessa, then at Helen. This nurse, she helped me. Grace's voice was weak, but every single word was so sharp and clear that no one dared to interrupt. No one came when I rang the call button. No one answered when I said I was in pain. She was the only one who stayed. Vanessa crossed her arms. Miss Whitmore, you've just given birth, so it's only natural that your emotions are a bit unstable, but our staff must follow hospital protocol. Grace stared at her for a long moment. Then, for the first time since stepping into Kingsley Meridian, she refused to look down. What kind of protocol leaves a laboring woman all alone for hours? No one answered. The steady beeping of the monitor was the only sound in the silence. Grace felt her entire body trembling from exhaustion. But something else was keeping her sitting upright, a burning sensation in her chest that she had suppressed for far too long. She had stayed silent when the hotel guests stared at her pregnant belly with pity, silent when Evan disappeared, silent when people asked where the baby's father was, silent when they shoved her into the room at the far end of the hallway, as if she were a shameful secret to be hidden away. But Helen didn't. That woman had risked her job to save her. Grace looked at Vanessa. If you want to blame someone, blame me. Helen did absolutely nothing wrong. Vanessa's voice turned cold. You don't understand the real issue here. No. Grace took a slow, painful breath. I think you're the one who doesn't understand. The room fell dead silent. Grace turned to look at the baby in the nurse's arms. He had stopped crying, his tiny eyes closed beneath the soft white blanket. Then she looked back at Vanessa. No one should ever be treated as if they are lesser, just because they aren't wealthy. A long silence stretched out. It was far more uncomfortable than any argument, because the truth always silences people longer than anger ever could. Vanessa turned to Helen once more. Do you know how this will affect your professional record? Helen stood perfectly still. Then she nodded. I know. She spoke so softly, her voice almost calm. But I would still do it all over again. Malcolm looked at Helen for a long moment. Something shifted ever so slightly in his eyes. It wasn't just gratitude. It was the realization that in the very hospital bearing his family's name, there were still people silently working to keep the place from turning completely into a heartless corporation. Vanessa opened her mouth to say more, but Malcolm spoke first. Lock down all system files related to this case. The entire room turned to look at him. Malcolm stepped toward the electronic console, his voice dropping low. I want the entire record edit history, room assignments, anesthesia requests, and access logs sealed immediately. He stared at Vanessa, not missing a single shift in her expression. After Malcolm Kingsley spoke, the air in the delivery room changed completely. No one looked at Grace as just another patient anymore. Not because of the money, not even because of the Kingsley name. But because for the first time tonight, everyone realized this was about something much bigger than a mismatched delivery room assignment. It was a family fracturing right before their eyes, in a room filled with the sharp smell of antiseptic and the steady beep of the heart monitor. Vanessa stood completely frozen. but Grace could see her hands clenching so hard her knuckles turned white. Malcolm didn't look at Vanessa again. He slowly pulled a chair up to Grace's bedside, looking like a man who had aged 10 years in a matter of minutes. Helen quietly took the baby from the young nurse and gently placed him in Grace's arms. Grace looked at her son, really seeing him for the very first time. His tiny nose, his flushed red skin, his soft, damp, dark hair, and behind his left ear a small, leaf-shaped birthmark she hadn't noticed before. The baby stirred in her arms, his tiny fingers wrapping around her pinky. Grace felt a lump rise in her throat. Meanwhile, Malcolm stared at the baby as if he were looking at both a miracle and a punishment. Finally, he spoke. Evan left home nearly 3 years ago. His voice was barely a whisper. It wasn't the voice of a man used to calling the shots in million-dollar boardrooms. It was the voice of a father, exhausted from carrying a heavy grief for far too long. Grace remained silent. Malcolm looked down at his hands. He always felt like he was never good enough. He let out a soft, bitter chuckle. It's funny, isn't it? Outsiders look at a family like ours and think money solves everything. Outside the narrow window at the end of the room, the Denver sky was growing dark. Heavy slate-gray clouds hung low over the distant high-rises, and the city lights began to flicker on like cold, distant embers. Malcolm leaned back in his chair. Evan grew up in a world where everything was mapped out for him, the best schools, the grandest houses. His first car at 16 was a Porsche. People looked at him and called him lucky. He paused for a few seconds, but no one ever asked if he was happy. Grace watched him. For the first time, she was hearing a wealthy man talk about money as a burden rather than a privilege. Malcolm continued, his mother, Margaret. She loved Evan so much, she almost lost herself in it. But I was different. I wanted him to be strong. I wanted him to be worthy of the Kingsley name. A dry, hollow sound escaped his throat. Men who think they are teaching their sons how to succeed rarely realize they are actually teaching them how to fear failure. Helen stood at the back of the room, quietly listening. Malcolm pulled out his phone and opened an old photograph. He handed it to Grace. It was a family photo taken in front of a snow-covered mansion in Aspen. Malcolm looked much younger. A blonde woman in a white sweater stood smiling next to him, and between them was a teenage boy about 17 years old. Grace froze. Those eyes, that smile, Evan, in the photo, he looked so much more relaxed than the man Grace had known. Malcolm stared at the photo. That year was the last time we ever went on vacation together. He gently traced the edge of his phone, as if trying to touch something that had long vanished from his life. When the crypto market boomed, Evan started investing like crazy. At first, he won big. Making money so fast made him feel invincible. Malcolm's voice dropped. Then, everything fell apart. Grace remembered how Evan used to talking about his actual job. He would always change the subject whenever she asked. Once, she woke up at 3 in the morning and found him sitting alone on the apartment balcony, staring at his phone screen with a pale face. Back then, she didn't understand. Now she was starting to. Malcolm continued. He owed money, not just to banks, but to people who were far more dangerous. Helen frowned slightly. Malcolm nodded. I paid off almost all of it. But what broke Evan wasn't the debt, it was the feeling of failure. He looked at Grace. He always believed I would only love him if he was as successful as I was. The room fell silent. Grace remembered the look in Evan's eyes the night she told him she was pregnant. It wasn't hatred, it wasn't coldness, it was fear. A fear so intense, it was almost suffocating. Malcolm rested his elbows on his knees. After Margaret passed away, things got worse. Grace looked up. How did she pass away? Malcolm remained silent for a long time before answering. a rare heart cancer. But I think the grief of losing her son killed her faster than the illness ever could. He closed his eyes for a few seconds. Margaret always believed Evan would come home. Every Sunday, she still set a place for him at the dinner table. Helen quietly turned her face away. The only sounds in the room were the beep of the monitor and the occasional rustle of the baby stirring inside his white blanket. Malcolm opened his phone again. This time, it wasn't a photo. It was emails. Dozens of unsent emails. The subject line, "Please come home. We can fix this. Your mother is asking for you. I don't care about the money anymore." Grace felt a sharp pain tightened in her chest. Malcolm gave a deeply sad, weary smile. "I sent more than 200 emails over 2 years, and not one was ever answered." He scrolled down further. Then he stopped. This is what first made me suspect that something was deeply wrong with this hospital. He handed the phone to Helen. An internal email thread appeared between Vanessa and the patient coordination department. Luxury, patient, placement optimization, insurance tier screening, low priority intake relocation. Helen scanned a few lines and her expression completely changed. Vanessa had set up a system to filter patients based on the value of their insurance. Nothing public, no official documents, but it was enough for the staff to understand who deserved to be seen in the VIP wing, and who should be pushed into the back hallways. Malcolm stared at the closed door. "I used to think Kingsley Meridian was the greatest pride of my life." He gave a faint, bitter smile. "Turns out, there was rot spreading right beneath the marble and I was completely blind to it." Just then, Malcolm's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. A message from internal security. "We found a recent transaction trail linked to Evan Kingsley, Utah." Malcolm instantly sat up straight. Grace looked at him. "Is something wrong?" Malcolm quickly read a few more lines. "A motel transaction in Salt Lake City. 2 days ago." He looked up. For the first time since walking into the delivery room, there was something like hope in his eyes. "I think I just found my son." The motel sat right next to the southern highway in Salt Lake City, where semi-trucks rumbling through the night made the window glass vibrate every time they passed. The red neon sign out front flickered with the word vacancy, 2 of its bulbs completely dead. On one side of the parking lot, puddles of rainwater reflected the dim glow from the only working streetlight. No one looking at this place would ever think someone who grew up in an Aspen mansion was living here. Malcolm Kingsley stood beside the black SUV he had hurriedly rented from the Utah airport, looking up at the rundown motel rooms in front of him. The air was cold and dry. The smell of engine oil from the highway drifted in the night wind. He had been driving for nearly 6 hours since leaving Denver, without a single minute of sleep. It wasn't because he had any strength left, but because if he stopped now, he was afraid he would never find the courage to keep going. The motel manager only pointed toward the 2nd floor after staring at the black card Malcolm had placed on the counter. "Room 214. He works the night shift at the shipping warehouse on the north side of town. Should be back in about half an hour." Malcolm nodded. He didn't go up to the room right away. He just stood under the dim yellow light of the parking lot, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his long overcoat, staring up at the weathered windows. For a moment, he thought about getting back in his car and driving away. For 3 years, he had lived with a sense of helplessness that had become painfully familiar. Every time he picked up Evan's trail, he would lose it just days later. Every unanswered call, every closed bank account, every fake address. He used to think he would be furious when he finally saw his son again. But after seeing that tiny baby in delivery room 4, His anger crumbled, completely crushed by something far heavier. It was regret. An old, beat-up white delivery van pulled into the parking lot just before 1 a.m. Malcolm recognized Evan almost instantly. His son climbed down from the driver's seat, wearing a faded dark blue jacket and boots caked in dirty snow. He was so much thinner than the last time Malcolm had seen him in Aspen. His shoulders slouched like a man accustomed to keeping his head down for far too long. Stubble covered his jaw, and his face was gaunt from sleeplessness. But it was still Evan. He still had those same grey eyes, just like Margaret's. Evan didn't notice his father at first. He opened the back of the van, unloaded a few remaining boxes, and slowly locked the door. Every movement was slow, the heavy drag of a man so utterly exhausted that his body ran purely on autopilot. Then he looked up and froze. The box in Evan's hand slipped, crashing onto the wet concrete. The sound echoed, sharp and hollow, in the freezing night air. Father and son stared at each other from less than 10 meters away, but it felt like a lifetime of distance lay between them. Evan was the first to look away. "You shouldn't have come here." His voice was raspy, barely a whisper. Malcolm didn't try to get closer right away. He knew his son. The more ashamed Evan felt, the faster he would run. "I've been looking for you for 2 years. Evan let out a soft, dry laugh. There was no humor in it. "You were looking for a different version of me." Malcolm looked at the battered van, and then at Evan's hands, raw and chapped from the biting cold. "No." He spoke very slowly. "I am looking right at my son." Evan lowered his head. A long, heavy silence settled over the motel parking lot. In the distance, the low rumble of trucks on the highway sounded like metallic waves rolling through the darkness. Finally, Malcolm pulled out his phone. He pulled up a photo and held it out toward Evan. Evan stared at it for a long moment before he finally found the courage to take the phone. It was a photo of a newborn baby wrapped in a white blanket. His tiny face was flushed under the bright hospital lights, his little hand, no bigger than half an adult's finger, clutching the edge of the blanket. Evan stopped breathing. He stared at the photo like a man who had just seen his own heart outside of his body. "Your son," Malcolm whispered. "He was born yesterday." Evan sank to the curb almost immediately, not because he wanted to, but because his knees no longer had the strength to hold him up. He pressed a hand over his mouth. His shoulders began to shake. Malcolm hadn't seen his son cry like this since the day Margaret died. There were no loud sobs, no excuses. Just a man who finally had nowhere left to run from himself. "I left her all alone," Evan choked out. I know. Malcolm sat down next to his son. Not too close, but close enough for Heaven to know he was there. Is he okay?" "He is." Malcolm looked at the photo in Evan's hand. "He has your mother's nose." Evan broke down completely at those words. He doubled over, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. "I'm not good enough for this." Evan's voice broke. "I've never been good enough." Malcolm looked at his son for a long time. Then he said the words he should have said years ago. "No one is born good enough to be a father." Evan looked up. His eyes were bloodshot and filled with despair. Malcolm continued. "You have to choose it every single day." A cold wind swept across the parking lot. An old receipt drifted across the concrete, getting caught against the tire of a delivery van. Evan kept his head bowed for a long time. Then, finally, he asked in a voice almost like a child's, "Does she hate me?" Malcolm thought of Grace in that small delivery room. He thought of how she still tried to protect Helen, despite having just endured 12 hours of pain. He thought of the look in her eyes when she spoke of Evan, both deeply hurt and exhausted. He answered honestly, "You hurt her." Evan closed his eyes, but she had still left the door open. 2 days later, Evan stood in the toy aisle of a small grocery store in Denver. He held a light brown teddy bear in his hands for a very long time, not because he couldn't afford it, but because he didn't know if he even had the right to buy it. Around him, ordinary families walked by, their shopping carts filled with diapers and boxes of cereal. A young father laughed as his little daughter, sitting in the cart, grabbed a box of cookies. Evan watched them like someone standing outside a glass window, looking at a life he thought he would never have again. In the end, he bought the bear. Then he drove to Grace's apartment in Denver. The run-down building sat next to a laundromat and a small Mexican restaurant. A faint, yellow hallway light flickered behind the aged glass door. Evan stood outside the door of apartment 3B for nearly 10 minutes without knocking. The teddy bear was still clutched in his hands. Cold sweat covered his palms, even though the Denver weather was freezing. He had imagined this moment hundreds of times on the drive over. Grace would slam the door in his face. Grace would tell him to go away. Grace would look at him like he was a total stranger, and perhaps she had every right to do so. Evan finally raised his hand, then let it fall back down. Inside the apartment, the faint cry of a newborn drifted through the door. That sound cut through Evan like a knife. He closed his eyes for a few seconds and knocked. Soft footsteps approached from the other side. The deadbolt turned slowly. The door swung open. Grace saw Evan standing there. She stood behind the door, cradling her baby. The dim yellow light inside the apartment spilled across her face, highlighting the dark circles under her eyes and the deep exhaustion of postpartum recovery. Her hair was hastily tied back. She wore an oversized cream sweater, holding her baby close as she tried to soothe him to sleep. She stared at Evan for a long time. There was no surprise in her eyes. She didn't burst into tears, and there was none of the warmth Evan had desperately hoped for on his drive over. Just a heartbreaking, quiet gaze from someone who had already cried all her tears. Evan stood frozen in the doorway, still clutching the teddy bear. His eyes were bloodshot from sleepless nights. His voice cracked. I'm so sorry." Grace didn't answer right away. Behind her, the apartment's old heater hummed softly. Out on the distant streets, a car horn wailed and then faded into the freezing Denver night. Evan lowered his gaze. "I know. I have no right to be here." Grace looked down at the baby in her arms. He was fast asleep, lips twitching slightly as if searching for a familiar warmth. A heavy silence stretched between them. Then Grace spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "No." She looked up, meeting Evan's eyes. "You had no right to just disappear like that." Every word she spoke was soft, yet they carried more weight than any scream ever could. Evan nodded slowly. He didn't try to make excuses anymore. He didn't say he was terrified. He didn't talk about the crushing debt. He didn't speak of the sleepless nights in cheap motels, or the delivery shifts that left him numb with exhaustion. Because right now, every single excuse paled in comparison to the woman who had gone through labor all on her own. Grace looked down at the stuffed bear in Evan's hands. Then, very slowly, she stepped aside. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. She simply didn't want her son to grow up facing a door that was permanently closed. Evan stepped into the apartment. The faint scent of baby formula and fresh laundry hung in the air. The space was so cramped that the tiny bassinet sat almost flush against the worn-out sofa. On the kitchen counter lay a few instant noodle cups, a pile of unpaid bills, and the cheap flower vase Helen had brought over the day before. The sheer modesty of it all was heartbreaking. Evan stood in the center of the room, looking lost, unsure of what to do with his hands. Grace walked over to the bassinet and gently laid the baby down. The little boy stirred slightly. Then he opened his eyes. For the very first time, Evan saw his son up close. Not through a photograph, not through a cold phone screen, but right here, dot in front of him. A fragile, tiny life, breathing softly. Existing in this world, carrying a piece of him in every single feature, almost on instinct, Evan sank to his knees beside the bassinet. He reached out a hand incredibly slowly, hesitating, terrified, as if he didn't deserve to even touch the child. And then his fingertips finally brushed against that tiny, delicate hand. For one brief second, the entire world seemed to stand still. The baby wrapped his tiny fingers around Evan's, so gently. Yet it was enough to shatter him completely. Evan bowed his head and finally broke down in tears, no more trying to hide it, no more trying to save face. Just a man who finally understood what he had almost lost. Grace stood behind him, watching it all. Her heart ached, not because all the pain had suddenly vanished, but because sometimes a person can still see the goodness in someone, even if they were the one who hurt them. A week later, the internal investigation at Kingsley Meridian Medical Center officially began. The emails Vanessa tried so hard to delete were recovered. The full edit history of the patient records resurfaced on the system. Security footage showed Grace being kept in the overflow hallway. Even though her labor was progressing rapidly, other buried reports began to surface as well. It wasn't just Grace. Countless patients with basic insurance had been transferred, had their care delayed, or were pushed to public hospitals, all to protect the pristine image of the luxury maternity suites. Vanessa Crowe was immediately suspended. 3 months later, the Colorado State Medical Board launched an official ethics investigation into her. On the day she left the hospital, Vanessa walked through the grand lobby that once felt like her empire in absolute silence. No one stood up to greet her. No more of the fearful, respect-filled glances she was so used to. Only the distant sound of the piano echoed through the air, completely indifferent to who had just lost their power. Some people spend their entire lives building a flawless image, only to lose everything. Simply because they forgot that others are human beings too. Helen Brooks was different. Malcolm met with her personally in the hospital administration office on a snowy morning in early January 21. He placed a new appointment letter in front of her, Director of Patient Ethics and Maternal Advocacy. Helen read it slowly, taking her time. She looked up. "I only did what was right." Malcolm offered a sad smile. "And that is exactly why this hospital needs you." 1 year later, Kingsley Meridian Medical Center had changed profoundly. The luxury maternity suites were still there. The warm lights were still soft. The piano still played every evening. But right next to the main reception desk, a new, brushed bronze plaque now hung on the wall. The Grace Whitmore Family Care Fund. It was a foundation for single mothers in need, established by Malcolm, using his own personal wealth following the investigation. There was no grand publicity, no major press conferences. It quietly covered medical bills, postpartum care, and emotional therapy for women who had once walked through these doors, feeling like they didn't belong anywhere. Inside the newly renovated maternity center, a small glass display case hung on the hallway wall. Inside was Grace's old white patient wristband. Beneath it, a simple inscription read, "No one should ever feel lesser when they are in need of care." That afternoon, Grace stood before the glass case, holding baby James in her arms. He was already beginning to smile. Evan stands by her side, holding a baby bag and a carton of milk they bought on the way back. He is far from perfect. He is still learning how to be a father, day by day. There are still moments when he falls into a long, heavy silence, weighed down by the guilt of his past. But this time, he isn't walking away. Malcolm stands at the far end of the hallway, quietly watching them. The winter afternoon sun filters through the massive glass windows, painting soft, honey-colored streaks across the polished marble floor. In that very moment, the hospital finally feels like a sanctuary of healing. Rather than just a place that sells luxury, Grace leans down, pressing a tender kiss onto her baby boy's hair. Little James giggles, reaching out to wrap his tiny hand around her finger. Some people cross your path at your absolute darkest moment, only to become the reason you find the strength to believe in humanity once more. Dignity is not a privilege. It is a fundamental human right.